Good morning or afternoon, however you decide to parse this time of day. I'm Arthur Herman, Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute, and thank you for coming, audience, to this book event, and thank you, audience on C-SPAN, for watching us in what I think will be an absolutely fascinating hour and a half, discussing Mark Moyar's new book, Strategic Failure. Strategic Failure is, I think, a book, as you will soon find out when you've read it, a book that every Republican presidential candidate ought to be reading and whose staff ought to be examining chapter by chapter to figure out how it is that we got into this terrible fix that we're in right now around the world, in the United States' position there, and also some key ideas about how we get ourselves out. Mark Moyar has written a book which I think, in terms of timeliness for understanding what's happening around the world, couldn't have been more in tune with where the American public is today. Poll after poll shows the American public is deeply disquieted with the way in which the United States is viewed around the world, with our position as vis-a-vis other powers, including Russia and China, and our allies, and are also worried about the increasing instability, increasing violence around the world, particularly with the rise of the radical terrorist organization ISIS. And a lot of people are thinking that when we elected Barack Obama in 2008, this is not where we were supposed to be. And this is a position, by the way, which the Obama administration has come to as well. Today's paper, Wall Street Journal, big front page article about why it is that Obama just doesn't seem to be getting a break. That here he came into office hoping to promote more stability and peace around the world, wanting to build a new relationship with Iran as a partner in the Middle East, wanting to deal with climate change, wanting to restore normalized relations with Cuba, and also at the same time to de-emphasize the role of military power, America's military power, and military presence around the world, and emphasizing instead diplomatic and economic engagement with the powers great and small that encompass the globe. And yet, son of a gun, it turns out, the article explained, despite Obama's great hopes for this future, this bright new future around the world, instead what he's been hit with is the rise of Russia, of China as aggressive powers in their respective regions, the rise of ISIS, the disintegration of what's happened of Iraq, and the possible disintegration of Afghanistan. And what a shame it is and how frustrating it may be. Our author today may figure that this is not such coincidence. And his book, as you'll find out, Strategic Failure, really deals with the root causes of the relationship between those two areas. Mark Moyar, who I'm welcoming here to this session at Hudson Institute, is, I think, a really remarkable military historian, scholar, in that he brings both an understanding of military history and also a keen grasp of how it applies to actual policy and the actual shaping of policy. In Mark's particular case, both in Iraq and also in Afghanistan. Mark Moyar, until recently, professor at the Marine Corps University with a chair in the study of counterinsurgency and terrorism, also formerly from the Joint Special Operations University, in which he was teaching, who's worked as a consultant to both Central Command and also to ISAF, the International Security Assistance Forces in Afghanistan, author of several books, one of the most remarkable, I think, and one I recommend to everyone, a book that really rewrites the history of the Vietnam War, at least the early part of the Vietnam War, Triumph Forsaken, which I know has had enormous impact on the way in which those of us interested in the American role in Asia, in relationship to our past ventures in Asia, in security and military presence, and our future role in Asia also closely relates. And so I'm really delighted that we'll have a chance now to ask Mark about not just his book, but also how he sees it fitting into the role of the United States in the world and the ways in which we deal with this. So Mark, let me ask you. As I mentioned talking about the Wall Street Journal article, that sense that we have that the relationship between the Obama administration's diminution of America's military presence, including, of course, military spending, and also that the relationship to the sudden growing instability around the world, that these things aren't quite a coincidence. Do you agree?
I do agree with that. We have some competing impulses within the Obama administration, which I think together have led us to this point. One thing that I think you always have to keep in mind with this administration is that from the beginning it has been focused more on domestic issues than international issues. I see a lot of parallels with it between this administration and the Johnson administration in Vietnam, which, as you mentioned, I've spent a lot of time looking at. And so early on in Obama's presidency, we see him getting into Afghanistan because it's a popular political issue for him. And he, like Lyndon Johnson, has a very ambitious domestic agenda. And so his policies are intended, in many respects, to keep international affairs off of the front page. And we see, as also occurred with Lyndon Johnson, that over time those foreign policy issues keep creeping in more and more. And one of the reasons for that is that with the sort of crisis management, keep the foreign news off of the front page. It puts you in a reactive foreign policy, and so you're not proactively pursuing some kind of strategy, which I think ultimately, again, eventually over time will come back to bite you. We also have, certainly within the Obama administration, an impulse that says we don't need to spend as much on the military. We can use civilian power, soft power, which is where the term smart power comes in. We're going to use less of the hard power. That's certainly been a big part of this administration's policies. Also, the idea that we could use drones and special operations raids as the hard power instrument that we could afford to cut down our conventional forces has been central to this approach. And we've seen, certainly in the case of Iraq, for example, we're now finally coming around to recognize that that may not have worked so well. So we're now scrambling to get back into the game. And this is unfortunately a pattern we've seen repeated through U.S. history, where there's a view that if we reduce our military spending, that we can reduce the risk of future war. We saw it after World War I, then we have World War II. Then after World War II, we cut defense thinking, okay, we don't need this, and then we have the Korean War 5 years later. And so what I think also is at work is that our adversaries are seeing that we, by cutting our defense spending, are actually reducing our deterrent capabilities. So to some extent, we're inviting further aggression by cutting back. And as a nation, we can often afford to go through this cycle of we cut our defense until the next war comes and then belatedly catch up. But unfortunately, that usually results in the death of a lot of Americans who are not sufficiently well prepared for the next war. So I think we owe it to those people within our armed forces to maintain that preparedness in addition to having some kind of deterrent power.
Let's talk about military spending and the Obama administration's cuts, which are, of course, not just the Obama administration, but also the impact of sequestration, of imposing rather arbitrary reductions in spending year after year when Obama and Congress could not reach an agreement on deficit reduction. Now, of course, critics are going to say, what's to worry? We're still the biggest military in the world. I think there's studies that are out there that show that 8 out of every $10 the world spends on military is spent by the Pentagon. We still have a military that covers the globe, and it has enormous global reach. We have technologies such as stealth and other kinds of military advantages and capabilities that no other country can match. Why should we really be worried about reducing military spending and military presence, not just in one place or another, let's say, like Iraq, or whether it's in Europe, but why should we worry about this as an ongoing part of how we do business and how the Pentagon is going to be able to sustain our forces?
Well, good question. I mean, one thing certainly is that we, in recent decades, have enjoyed a technological edge, but we've seen that slipping, partly through espionage, but we certainly see, I think, a rising threat from China and Russia. So looking in the long term, we certainly want to keep investing, and with sequestration especially, we've hurt our R&D spending. The uncertainty in the environment has undermined a lot of the R&D that's been going on in the defense sector. I also think in terms of ground forces, there is a real concern that we just don't have enough. We are the world's only global power, and part of the administration's approach, their view was that we were going to get a lot of other countries to pick up the slack for us. But unfortunately, if you look, the record is pretty poor. I mean, NATO, we tried to get them involved in Afghanistan, they let us down. NATO's defense spending is paltry, and even though we've threatened them and cut our own spending, they still are not acting. We can't get the Middle Eastern countries to do the kinds of things we would like. So there isn't really a viable substitute, I think, for American power. And if you look at what's going on today, I mean, Iran, there is certainly a lot for us to be concerned about there. Our land forces are still relevant. They're relevant as a deterrent, I think, to Iran to some extent. Also, if we actually have to deal with Iranian nuclear weapons at some point. If you look at Eastern Europe, which the situation is very troubling now, we have now very belatedly seen the Obama administration send token forces to Eastern Europe on a temporary basis. But I think there's clearly now a recognition that we need more forces in Eastern Europe. And Afghanistan, it's again not clear what we're going to do there, but I think we need forces there. So given how small our ground forces are, I think we really do need more of them to do the sorts of things that need to be done today.
Now, the last really extensive ground operation the United States conducted was, of course, Iraq. And one of the most significant changes that has happened during the Obama administration has been a shift in policy in how to deal with Iraq, with the role of American presence there, and the question of, which you see debated in the media all the time now, which is that who is really to blame for the growing mess and instability in not just in Iraq, but in that entire region, and with it also the role of ISIS. How do you assess those issues?
I think in Iraq, certainly you can question the wisdom of going in 2003. I think now, given what we know about WMD and the intelligence problems, that there's a strong case to be made that if we had it all to do over again, we would have left Saddam Hussein in power. But that's with 2020 hindsight. You know, when President Obama comes to office in 2009, that's long past, and he's faced with a situation where we have expended a great deal of American blood and treasure to pacify Iraq. And this is after, of course, if you may recall, President Obama, during the 2007 surge, was saying this wasn't going to work. But by 2009, he agrees that, hey, Iraq has gone pretty well. We've got a democracy. We have Sunnis, Shiites, Kurds living together. And we have, I think at that point in time, Iraq was on the road to potentially becoming a really groundbreaking development in the Arab world, that you had a democracy that was functioning. You had different groups largely getting along. And so whatever else you may have thought of what happened before that, we really had an opportunity in Iraq at relatively low cost to see this through. And the military at the time was arguing, situation is still fragile in Iraq. We need American troops here in the long term to help preserve this. And if you look at what's going on in Iraq 2009, 2010, you can see pretty clearly the value of the American footprint, military footprint in Iraq, because you have lingering tensions between Shiites and Sunnis, between Arabs and Kurds, and American forces are there, sometimes actually on the ground, preventing those forces from actually coming to blows. We also have the U.S. military presence allowing us to influence the Iraqi government, President or Prime Minister Maliki, because he certainly had his Shiite predilections early on, but because we had troops there and because we really wanted to make this work, we were able to tell him, back off on these provocative actions you're taking.
Now, this was in 2009, 2010.
Yes, and then we have, in 2010, there's a disputed parliamentary election where...
And as I recall, just to interrupt you, just
Sure.
to remind everybody, that was also about the time in which the Obama administration was touting the peace and stability in Iraq as one of its leading foreign policy accomplishments.
That's correct. That's absolutely right. And so you get to this election 2010 where there's a party, the Iraqi party, which is Sunnis and some secular Shiites. They get the slight majority over Maliki's Dawa party, and there's an impasse where neither side can get a majority. And the U.S. has certainly in its power the ability to decide who is going to be the prime minister. And you have a dispute within the administration. You have Vice President Biden, who is the president's point man, pushing for Maliki. You have people like General Mattis, the CENTCOM commander, saying, we think Maliki is not the best candidate. He seems to be moving too close to Iran. He's too sectarian. But Biden and his camp win the day. They keep Maliki. They ensure that he becomes the prime minister and stays on. And so I do think, you now hear the administration blaming everything on Maliki. I think it's a little disingenuous because they really are responsible for keeping him in there. Then you get to 2011, a lot of debate over what the U.S. future is going to be like. For the most part, Biden and others do think we're going to have some presence. Most of the debate is over how big of a presence after 2011 the U.S. will have. And the Obama administration, late in the day, brings up these claims that we need Parliament, the Iraqi Parliament, to approve our presence, and we need them to give us immunity, give our troops immunity from prosecution. And this will later be used by the administration to say, well, hey, we were forced out of Iraq because the Iraqis put these conditions on us. This was 2013 when things are going around. Well, fast forward to 2014, if you recall, once we decide we want to be in there, we send our troops back in without getting those grants of approval from Parliament. So that was, I think, a pretext. I think Obama himself did not want to keep troops there, partly just because he didn't think it was necessary. Partly, he was going around telling everyone with the election come up that I've ended the war in Iraq, although the war was really over, but he wanted to be able to claim that we're out. And as soon as we get the last troops out at the end of 2011, Maliki's sort of unleashed. He issues an arrest warrant for his own vice president, who's the leading Sunni politician. All sorts of other Sunnis that get arrested. And in the ensuing period, Maliki really starts arresting more Sunni oppositionists, kicks a lot of the Sunnis out of the armed forces, which Americans then are kind of wondering, well, 2014, why is the Iraqi army so bad? Well, because we let Maliki kick out a lot of the Sunni officers, and a lot of the Sunnis ended up going over to ISIS. So I think it was clearly avoidable. I think it's
a great recruiting tool for ISIS, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that was perhaps the biggest single blunder of his presidency, of which there's been quite a few, but the decision not to keep American troops in Iraq.
And let's probe it just a little bit at why we didn't, and why the Obama administration was reluctant to push on a status of forces agreement. I know some people even arguing that they never had any intention of having a status of forces agreement. They wanted all American troops out. But didn't it really rest on a fundamental assumption, which you see very often in certain foreign policy circles, and that is that a U.S. military presence is almost always a provocative presence. that it tends to either foment confrontation, to stir up animosities, stir up anti-American feeling, destabilize countries and regions when we have a robust U.S. military presence. And that on the converse, that when you pull back American forces, people talk about the Obama retreat, right, American retreat. When you pull back the American military presence, keep as the terminology goes, right, small footprint, maybe even an invisible footprint, then in fact you are actually doing well in terms of foreign policy and in terms of an American security policy that encourages stability and discourages conflict. Is your thesis in this book really that what we're seeing unfolding is just the opposite?
Yeah, that's right, and that's a point the Obama administration has made in several key places. So Iraq, certainly it was a big part of their argument. It's ironic because you don't need to look back very far within Iraq to see that argument is false. It was actually the basis of early U.S. occupation policy in Iraq under General Casey from 2004 to 2006. General Casey and John Abizaid and others were arguing that the biggest cause of conflict within Iraq is this xenophobic reaction against the American presence. And so let's try to pull our troops back. So there was a conscious effort repeatedly to pull American troops into bases where they're away from the population in the premise that once we do that, then the Iraqis are going to calm down. Well, once we did that, what we actually saw was that the Iraqis who were attacking us just started attacking the Iraqi government. And the Iraqi government kept failing. And so when finally General Petraeus comes in 2007, we finally realized that, actually the answer to these problems are Americans because the Iraqis can't do it. And so we do see Americans come in. And again, Senator Obama in 2007 was saying, Americans, if we send more troops, it's just going to stir up the hornet's nest more. Well, of course, that turns out not to be the case. So it certainly proved false in Iraq. I mean, again, there was a sense too, we pull out in 2011, things will be better in Iraq. Of course, we then saw the rise of ISIS. Didn't work out well there. Afghanistan, the administration made the same argument. When we pull our troops out of Afghanistan, things are getting better, but we've seen in Afghanistan, as the Americans pull out, the violence levels have actually increased. Afghans now are just focusing on the Afghan government. Saw it in Libya as well. The administration said, well, we're not going to send troops into Libya after we destroy their government because that's going to stir up insurgency. So if we don't put our troops in to Libya, then there won't be an insurgency, which of course we've again seen Libyans at each other's throats, massive violence, chaos. So it's an unfortunate theory that there may be certain cases where, yes, the people don't like Americans and that may incite violence, but as a general principle, arguing that this should be a driving force, I think the truth is that most of these enemies are not simply driven by the American presence, and that you're better off, in some cases, using Americans if necessary because our allies simply cannot do what we would like them to do.
Let's talk about Afghanistan. Some of the most fascinating parts of your book deal with Afghanistan. That's a war, it's an operation with which you've been intimately familiar, been advisor to ASAF on that. Give us your assessment about both the trajectory of the Obama policy, starting from 2009 when they put together their strategy in dealing with Afghanistan, to where we are now, and then maybe give us some idea about where you think things are going to go if current trends continue.
Afghanistan has a lot to do with how I came to write the book. I don't go into this in the book, but as you mentioned, I've spent a fair amount of time in Afghanistan working on Afghan issues. And when President Obama came in 2009, he promising that he was going to ramp up what he called the smart war. But, Iraq, he had called the dumb war. But Afghanistan was seen as being the war that was popular. The 9/11 attackers came from there. So he was going to get tough, and this was partly to show that he was tough on national security. And he does agree to increase troops, which I thought at the time was a good idea. Most of the military applauded that. But at the same time he was doing that, he put a very short time frame on their participation against the advice of the military. And the effects of that, I think, proved to be quite devastating. And I saw, and many others saw, that a lot of the Afghans were hedging their bets, or they were not siding with the United States in 2010, 2011, because they were afraid we were going to sell them out just as we had in the 1990s. And so I and a lot of others were very dissatisfied with this timeline that President Obama put on, which clearly seemed to be motivated by politics. And the more we know about it, I think the more that's true. And Obama and many of his aides have admitted that the decision to go in was driven by this political self-interest rather than the merits of the situation. So that's been very troubling. I think what's been even more troubling for me and a lot of others was how the decision was made then in 2011 that we're going to pull out halfway through the counterinsurgency campaign, which General Petraeus and the Joint Chiefs were saying, okay, we've pacified southern Afghanistan, now we need to go do the other big hotbed of insurgency, which is eastern Afghanistan. And the Obama administration decided it's been kind of costly and expensive, and we don't think we really need to do that. And people like Vice President Biden are saying, well, counterinsurgency hasn't worked that well. So we're going to pull out halfway through. We aren't going to do what the military says, and we're now saying that all these people that we got killed in southern Afghanistan, that we didn't really need to do that. And so, and the way that was presented to the public, I think, was very misleading. So a lot of that is what led me to write this book, along with the pullout in Iraq in 2011. I think there was a lot of us who, in the early years of the Afghan war, were willing to go along and try to do the best we could to support things. I think by 2012, there's such a sense that the administration is more focused on its own political gains and not really concerned about what's going on in these countries. And we've seen, as mentioned before, there was this view, at least ostensibly, that if we pull out of Afghanistan, that the Afghans were going to stop fighting so much against us, that the Taliban could be reconciled because they were there more because America was there, and once it was just Afghans, that they would get together. Again, we've seen intensified violence. I mean, earlier this year, we had leading U.S. generals saying that the Afghan forces are taking casualties at a rate that is unsustainable. And we've clearly also mismanaged relations with Pakistan, who, they have continued to support the Taliban. I think we had an opportunity. This was another problem with the rapid pullout, is the Pakistanis came to the view that America was not in the region for the long haul. So they wanted to back the Taliban to come back, and they've continued backing because they think we're going to leave, and then India is going to fill some of the void there, and they can't stand for that. So, I do think at one point it looked like we were not even going to have troops in Afghanistan right now. We've backed a bit on that, I think partly because we saw how bad it was in Iraq. But I think we certainly, if we continue to de-escalate there as under current plans, I think Afghanistan is going to fall apart, and that's also going to have tremendously damaging ramifications in Pakistan, where we also have great interests.
Now, a critic would say it was a hopeless case from the start. We put in the wrong person, President Karzai, who was hopelessly corrupt. The government is hopelessly corrupt. The ANA, the Afghan National Army, is corrupt and incompetent, like its Iraqi counterpart. That what we look at when we look over what's happening in the Middle East, what we're really seeing is societies and countries which are in a state of extended collapse and failure. And there's really nothing the United States could have done to patch this situation up. That trying to establish democracy in Afghanistan and in Iraq was a fool's errand, and that the United States should have instead maintained a kind of hands-off approach, and that it's not just that it's the best policy, but it's the only it's the best worst policy in dealing with countries and in situations like that. Given your experiences in Afghanistan, do you think this would have had a completely different outcome? We'd be at a very different point now than we are if a different strategy and if a different policy had been followed.
There's been certainly a lot of mistakes that were made in Afghanistan. I think we've struggled because we've vacillated between a policy of trying to turn Afghanistan into a viable democracy and one of more narrowly focusing on our own interests. One of the things you've got to keep in mind with Afghanistan is in the early days, trying to rebuild Afghanistan, we outsourced a lot of that to the Europeans. Police, for example, we let the Germans handle that, and they assigned few resources to it. It was very poorly managed, and so we lost a lot of time. And this is, again, a problem of our European allies. And I think it'd be great if we could get the French and the Germans to do things and take the burden off us, but the reality is that they have not been able to do a lot of the things we would like them. So we got behind the curve on Afghanistan, and also simply because of Iraq, we were sending most of our resources to Iraq. It is a long-term process to nation build, and I think we too often neglect that. It's a generational project, and there are certainly valid questions if the American people have the patience for this. I personally think,
well, nations building has become a dirty word now in politics. You can't go on Capitol Hill and let's talk about nation building without being shown the door.
Yeah, that's right. And part of it is, again, I think the hasty approaches in Iraq and Afghanistan have undermined that. Again, we sometimes think we can dump huge amounts of resources in and it's going to solve the problem in a short period, and it is a long-term process. But I think this really gets into the debate within the Obama administration about what to do in Afghanistan. Because 2009, you have a lot of the leading figures saying, hey, we are going to nation build, although we're not going to call it that, but we're going to do counterinsurgency, we're going to pacify this place, secure it. And then you have Vice President Biden and certain other individuals saying, that's too ambitious. What we should just do is focus on killing terrorists. We're going to use drones and special operations forces to do that. And 2009, Biden, people like Petraeus, General McChrystal, Secretary of Defense Gates, they really argue that Biden's strategy is really absurd, that trying to just focus that narrowly is not going to work in the context of Afghanistan. And so Biden loses out in 2009, but then fast forward to 2011, Biden is continuing to make these arguments. He's coming up with arguments that counterinsurgency hasn't worked in Afghanistan, and so he is able then to gain new supporters for his strategy thanks to the fact that Petraeus, McChrystal, Gates, Mullen are moving on, and you now have more political supporters of the president moving into senior positions. And so you do get the president to finally buy off on this Biden strategy of we're going to use our drones and special operations forces to kill any enemies that happen to be here. And by the way, this then becomes strategy not just for Afghanistan, but for the U.S. presence writ large, which then conveniently allows the administration to say, hey, we don't need big ground forces because we can use special operations and drones.
Let's talk about drones for a second. Because when we talk about the hands-off, small footprint approach to American conflict, American power everywhere, but particularly in the war on terror, this has obviously become a hallmark of the Obama administration. The numbers of Predator drone attacks, if you chart them on a graph from the Bush administration, which really initiated the use of lethal force administered by unmanned aerial vehicles, to the Obama administration, it's a straight curve up. And now it's become the principal tool by which Obama and his advisors deal with the terrorist threat that they dare not name. This is a reliance which Obama administration justifies on the grounds that it's been highly successful in crippling Al-Qaeda. Was it just a couple of weeks ago there was a senior Al-Qaeda official in Libya who was killed by Predator drone strike? And the Obama administration has been able to point to these numbers of high-profile, high leadership positions that have been vacated thanks to Predator drone strikes, and to the body count, if I can use that term, for the war on terror, thanks to the drone strikes, as measures of success. What I find interesting about your book, and I'm going to ask you about that particular, but I want to do it this way. What I find so interesting about your book is that while most of us right now are focused on the threat from ISIS, you remind us that the fact that Al-Qaeda far from being an extinct presence, is actually very much alive and very much part of the terror networks and part of the growing threats that we have to deal with. What's the relationship here between Obama's much touted drone strike and counterterrorist strategy and the continuing growth and continuing viability of Al-Qaeda, not to mention ISIS?
Right. Yeah. Well, the drones certainly can be tactically useful. They have scored some notable successes. The problem with the administration is that they've turned them into a strategy in many cases, and as a substitute for other things that need to be done. And this is also, I think, driven by domestic politics. I mean, early on, the president and Rahm Emanuel saw this as a way to show the president tough on national security. I think a lot of the information that's been fed to the public about drones was inaccurate. The administration touted the numbers in Pakistan. It turns out the vast majority of the people who were killed in Pakistan were not important terrorists. A lot of them were people who were enemies of the Pakistani government, who the Pakistani government wanted to get rid of. There's been, unfortunate number of innocent civilians killed. We've also seen most countries don't even let us use the drones. It's mostly been Pakistan and Yemen where we've been able to do a lot. Yemen, a pretty stark case of the limitations.
So
of
in other
drones.
words, let me just back up for a second so we understand the full import of that. So the fact that so many of these predator strikes and killing of high-profile terrorist and Al-Qaeda leaders happen in Yemen and Pakistan isn't because that's where they're all hanging out. It's because those are the two countries which have the most liberal policy about letting America conduct those strikes.
Right, and we've seen over time, and in both those cases, over time, our permissions diminished because of the fact that we were killing the wrong people in many cases, or because of the fallout from other things. I mean, the bin Laden raid, which again was seen as this great example of precision strikes, actually led the Pakistanis to shut down our drone base and to interfere with the CIA, which is collecting the information. And we do know, even when the drones were at their height in Pakistan, you had Najibul Azazi, the subway bomber, and Faisal Shahzad, who got that truck into Times Square with an SUV bomb. They were actually training in Pakistan in those areas at the same time. But perhaps most troubling is that the extremists have been able to find ways to beat the drones. They've got counter-drone technology, and in Pakistan in particular, what we've seen is that they have moved. Al-Qaeda has moved into the big cities where we can't use our drones. The government will let us use the drones, and there's too much risk of civilian casualties. So the impact of drones has been declining. Still, I mean, certainly there's still value to them, and the surveillance capabilities are good. But Yemen has totally gone to pieces. The military was actually pushing President Obama to use counterinsurgency as well as these precision strikes, and the administration said, no, we don't need to do that. Well, of course, the insurgents took over the country earlier this year, and now we had to pull out all of our special operators and the CIA, so now we really can't do much at all in terms of drone strikes. There was one recent success which got a lot of attention, but it turned out that was a signature strike, which is something that's just based on suspicious behaviors. We didn't actually know that that was a senior Al-Qaeda leader. And as you may know, the world's leading terrorist bomb maker is still living in Yemen. We haven't been able to get him. So I very much worry about Al-Qaeda in Yemen. In Pakistan, again, they've been somewhat quiet recently, but from most indications, they seem to be rebuilding in Pakistan's cities, and that's, again, part of the fear. If we pull out of Afghanistan, I think that will further embolden Al-Qaeda in Pakistan.
Okay, so if the drone strategy isn't working, and now let's hear some prescriptions from Mark Moyar about how to correct the direction. In my last questions, I will be getting to these in a broader sense, but for now, looking at the drone strategy, what's the alternative for the United States?
Well, certainly a lot of the good alternatives, actually, I think we have lost out now. We've made some decisions where we've put ourselves in a hole. So Yemen, a year ago, we could have been talking about how we were going to build up the government's counterinsurgency capabilities. We are now don't have a government to work with, so it's going to be a lot harder. I think we do, at some point, try to build up larger military forces. In the case of Yemen, we're trying to get the Arab countries to do that. I don't think they're doing a very good job. Pakistan, again, our relationship now with them is in pretty sorry shape because of events of recent years. I think we can, to some extent, ease some of the Pakistani government concerns about Afghanistan by maintaining a U.S. presence. And I think we need to actually increase our presence there. You know, the current small footprint is not what our military recommended, so we need more troops there for the long term. And you know, even if we're not going to keep them there forever, I think we need to make clear that we're going to keep them there as long as we need to. And if it's going to be 100 years, you know, we can tell people that. I mean, simply conveying the message that we don't have plans to pull out, I think, is very important.
Don't we still have troops in Germany? 70 years, and we still have troops, I think, in South Korea after what? That's getting on towards 70 years, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
And it doesn't require the size that you're talking about isn't numbering in the hundreds of thousands. It's not requiring commitments of that size.
Right.
But it is commitments to a specific kind of strategy. Your other book, which I should mention here as well, in addition to your book on Vietnam, is a book on the history of counterinsurgency doctrine and the evolution of it. And I think that for a lot of people, what has happened as a result of the war in Iraq and the Petraeus surge, its very success, I think in some way, did something to poison the well, because counterinsurgency became, first of all, associated with state building, which, as I say, is a dirty word. There's a bipartisan consensus on defense on the Hill right now is that we do not want to engage in state building. And also it became identified with long, grueling processes in which the Iraq War unfolded from its very hopeful beginnings in 2003 until finally the Petraeus surge really paid off almost on the eve of the 2008 election. So as an advocate of counterinsurgency and saying that this is an important strategy which the United States needs to hang on to and be aware of, not the only one, but a key one here, how do you deal with those who are critics of counterinsurgency and say that it is, A, either gets us so involved in other countries' affairs that we are, in which it's a hopeless task, a fool's errand, or B, that it takes so long, American public won't have the patience for it, and it's a strategy that in the long term is one of diminishing returns?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think there's unfortunately a lot of people who think that counterinsurgency itself does not work. And I recently reviewed a book in the Wall Street Journal called How to Lose a War the Right Way, or The Right Way to Lose a War.
That was a good review, yes.
And that book basically makes the argument that these kind of insurgency wars are inherently intractable. And my point is that counterinsurgency, part of the problem that you alluded to is that some of the counterinsurgency enthusiasts kind of believe that you just had to pull out this manual and do these things and counterinsurgency was going to work great. And it's more complicated than that. So that's why we think we've seen some disillusionment. And I think part of the Obama administration's frustration with Afghanistan was that it wasn't as easy as some of the proponents suggested. So what I believe, and certainly what I've argued, is that counterinsurgency depends heavily on the leadership, the human capital that's brought to bear on both sides. So if you have a strong pool of leaders on the counterinsurgency side, chances are pretty good you're going to succeed. And historically, we've seen quite a few that have worked well. We've seen the Philippines, Colombia, certain degree El Salvador. We've seen successes in Afghanistan and Iraq. And so we need to, I think, try to move people away from the view that counterinsurgency is either a cure-all or that it never works, because it very much depends on the context and who is involved.
And couldn't you say that one of the reasons why the evolution of a successful strategy in Iraq took so long was because after Vietnam and what was felt to be the failed U.S. strategies there, including counterinsurgency, that those doctrines were sort of put in the shelf, allowed to gather dust, and lay forgotten, even with the Marine Corps, which is, of course, the great progenitors of counterinsurgency warfare, and that this is one of the problems, is that when you don't treat it as an important tool in the box, you find yourself in situations in which you've got to go back to the old toolbox, and go and dig it out again, dust it off, and try and get it to work. And you have perhaps crucial decade or two of lost doctrine.
Yeah, I think that's one of the big problems we face now. You know, in the 2012, the Obama administration said we're not going to be sized to do prolonged stability operations, and basically, I think there was a sense that, well, we've done counterinsurgency, it was messy, we didn't really like it, so if we remove our capability to do it, then we won't do it again. And unfortunately, what we've seen historically is that we get surprised by these kinds of wars. Both Iraq and Afghanistan, if you recall, we didn't want to do counterinsurgency in either of those places, and Bush came to power saying we're not going to do these kind of things. But we ended up being in Iraq. All of a sudden, things go south, and we decide we can't afford to pull out. Afghanistan, we went in, we turned things over to the Europeans. They couldn't handle it. Al-Qaeda makes a resurgence, and we decide that it's in our interests to go back in there and do counterinsurgency. And so I think we are very poor at understanding or predicting when the next war is going to be. But the idea that we can know that we're not going to have to do one of these things again, I think is very dangerous. And ultimately, again, if we're not prepared, the people who are going to pay the most are the people in the armed forces who are not going to be prepared for that war.
With America's retreat during the 6.5 years of the Obama administration, now has come the advance of other powers, Russia, China, Iran. Now, you can't make the argument that these strategic failures that you described in the book with the policy to those countries is the result of withdrawal of American troops from those countries and those regions. How do you attribute this? What is it? There's a pattern, obviously, here to the way in which these aggressor nations are now taking full opportunity. But how is it related directly to the way in which the Obama administration policies in other areas have rebounded to creating new strategic threats in other parts of the world?
You know, certainly the cut in the defense budget, which was driven to a large extent by what was going on in the Middle East, has had a global impact. I think our enemies have been encouraged by that, and perhaps more importantly, our friends have become more concerned. They doubt our credibility. But I think also, added to that is they look at decisions that the United States has made. The Syrian red line that we then backed away from. The administration has pretty consistently been reluctant to stand up for things. The Ukraine is a particularly disturbing example where we had agreed to protect them if they gave up their nuclear weapons, but then they're under attack and we don't really do anything. I think that's particularly disconcerting. And we've done, in the case of China, we kind of provoked them by saying we were going to pivot to Asia, which I think that actually stimulated their defense spending, but then we ended up not executing the pivot because we cut the defense budget and we didn't have the resources to send there. So I think there's been a lot of missteps in terms of public messaging, which really is, I think, a White House responsibility, because we've seen, we saw Secretary of Defense Gates tried to mitigate some of the problems in his tenure, but ultimately foreign leaders pay attention to what the White House is saying. But also our just cuts in our capabilities. We're now headed down below 3% of GDP. I think has created a lot of worries among countries, and a lot of countries want to end up being on the side of the power that's going to be most powerful in their region, and they're thinking it's not going to be the United States.
And in the conclusion of your book, you have this statement. You say, by the time Barack Obama vacates the White House, he could go down in history as a president who forfeited America's global captaincy and ushered in a long era of global strife and instability. Now, the next president, as Obama vacates and the new one moves in, let's assume that he or she wants to reverse that process. Mm-hmm. Now's your chance to tell us about how you would prescribe, what advice you would be giving to a president in order to reverse that process. Start with a specific. What would you do? How would you handle now with the situation in Afghanistan in order to bring that to success or even victory?
Well, I would first commit the U.S. to a presence beyond 2016. And I said, I think we need to increase the number of troops probably to at least 20,000 there. And they don't have to be going out on operations
So
necessarily.
that's not a big jump.
It's not. And I think for Iraq, the same thing. I think we need at least 20,000 troops there. I mean, what we're doing right now, we're keeping troops behind the wire. In Iraq, in the short term, we're going to have to send people out. There's not a quick fix now in Iraq because of what we've done. So, we can't just have the Kurds do everything, and the Turks are now going to come in. We can't do an Anbar awakening anytime soon because we've so alienated the Sunnis. We don't really want the Shiites just going in and taking things over and putting the country fully into Iran's orbit. So that's going to be a longer-term process, I think, in the case of Iraq. But I think, broadly too, we need to increase defense spending to at least 4% of GDP, which historically is relatively low, but I think you could even justify going to 5%, but certainly 4% is doable. But I think a lot of, too, what the next president has to do is to re-engage with the public. This president has done very little to explain to the American people why we need overseas commitments. And if you look at polls, people say, well, public support for overseas interventions is down, and I think a lot of that is actually the president's fault, because if you look, he came into office in 2009 saying he was going to get tough in Afghanistan. He felt he had to do that to show that he was serious on national security, and at the time, people supported that. He got elected on this pledge to get tough. I think the public support has faded because they've seen the president is not committed to these conflicts. He doesn't go out and explain to the people as more effective presidents have done. So you need somebody who's going to go out there and vigorously explain to people, why do we need to spend 4% of GDP on defense? Why do we still need to be engaged in the world? And I think that will go a long way. The other thing in terms of public messaging is I just think there has to be a new tone. This administration tends to react to crises by saying, the first thing they're saying is no American boots on the ground. And while certainly we don't want to just send American troops in wherever they are needed, this administration has been too ready to rule out options, and I think that really has encouraged other countries, and it's been a discouragement to our allies who feel like we're not going to be there for them when things get tough.
So we spend more time talking about what we're not going to do than talking about and thinking about what we are going to do. Should we open it up to questions from the audience?
Sure, that'd be great.
If you could, when you will have a microphone come around to you, if you could give us your name and also any institutional affiliation you care to divulge. Starting in the back here to the gentleman there. Yeah.
Thank you for, thank you for your good talk. My name is Bill Mikhail. I teach political science at George Washington University. I just met one of my students here, Charlie. I have a question. 32 days from now, from today, it will be the 25th anniversary of Saddam's invasion of Kuwait. Many people say the war ended wrongly in February, March of 1991. How did this conclusion by Bush Sr. and Powell contributed to what we are witnessing now? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question, which is it take a lot of time to go into all the ramifications of it. I mean, the short answer, I guess I would say that it might have made sense to go in at that point, but I do think at that time we probably would have, we likely would have made the same mistake of underestimating what it would have taken to pacify and stabilize the country. Now, I do think there was an option that you could have pursued then, and you probably could have done again in 2003, which is basically decapitate the regime and then put the rest of the population, or put the rest of the leadership there, let the military essentially run it, keep it as an authoritarian government. And had you done that, certainly things would have played out differently. It's really hard to know all the steps that would have come in that interim. I certainly think now, looking back in hindsight, probably a lot of people think, hey, it would have been great if Saddam was still there because we wouldn't have had to deal with that messy conflict, and now Iran had become the dominant force in there. And I think there's a fair amount of truth to that, although again, I think we could have prevented Iran from gaining its dominant position had we not pulled out in 2011, because that really has opened the door, and that's going to be very hard for us to get away from, because now you have 100,000 Iraqi troops who've been trained by the Iranians, only a very small number who we have trained. But I do think that's, in the long term, what we have to, I think there's still a hope that we can keep it from becoming completely pro-Iranian, because that's, I think, the only way. I still think you can have a unified Iraqi government. Trying to do a 3 separate governments. I mean, one thing, you've got a problem with the Kurds now, in that Turkey is saying they're going to go in militarily because they don't want a Kurdish nation. And getting the Sunnis, having a Sunni state is also, it may be workable, but right now the Sunnis, there's not really a good way for us to engage them because we've let them down repeatedly. So trying to rehabilitate them is going to be problematic. So I think again, we have to be in Iraq for a long period of time now, unfortunately.
Back there, and then we'll come forward. I'm sorry, back just behind you. There you go.
Thank you. My name is Carmine DeFilio. My affiliation is not relevant to this meeting. I was wondering what your attitude is towards the kind of neocon idea that bringing democracy to the Middle East is going to advance our political interest there, or our self-interest there. Do you have any opinions on that?
Yeah, I think there was certainly there's some merit to it. I think, again, how we got to Iraq's position in 2009 is not probably how we would have liked to have gotten there, but I do think there was an opportunity created that it would have made sense. I do think in 2003 there were a lot of people who underestimated what it would take to democratize Iraq, and I think there was a belief that you just introduce the institutions and you can quickly democratize the country. I think what experience has shown is that culture is a big part of democracy. You have to have a culture that is tolerant and is willing to embrace democracy, and you don't have that typically in authoritarian states. So it's a long-term process. I think 20 years or more oftentimes is going to be required. I think in hindsight, does it make sense to invade countries and then try to impose democracy militarily? I think we've seen from Iraq and Afghanistan it's a lot harder than we thought. So I think in terms of doing it militarily, I think we have reason to be more pessimistic. I do think in the long term, I think you can still make a case. I mean, there's still debate, I think, over whether Islamic countries can really be made, or at least Arab Islamic countries can be made into democracies. I don't think it's impossible. Again, I think we had a great opportunity in Iraq to show it was working, and it didn't work. Tunisia is now possibly an option as well, although, again, we're seeing just the catastrophic terror attack on Friday, that Tunisia is in a very fragile place, and there are certainly people there who want democracy, but that's by no means certain. So that's another place we need to really keep our eye on.
I'm going to say 2 quick words in support and partly in disagreement with Mark on those points. One is, I think it's important to realize, this comes back to the professor's question too, that one of the factors that perhaps would have made the drive to Baghdad in the first Gulf War have a more successful outcome would have been, we would not have been in the awkward position, humiliating position a year later of having betrayed the Shiite revolt that we encouraged against Saddam, and that poisoned relations with the Shiite majority in the country and opened the door to a great degree to Iran to cultivate its connections there. And the other question about democracy in Iraq, it's also important to remember that the idea that Iraq would be the perfect laboratory for creating a democratic regime goes way back to the 1980s, 1970s, 1980s. It was a State Department fixture of the idea that Iraq was the one Arab country in which there was, even under Saddam, survival of a stable civil society that would make cultivating relations with Iraq both much easier and supportive, but also could lead to the evolution of a democratic Iraq in that process. And one of the factors which helped to undermine that, if you read Ms. Fly's recent book on the outcome of the war in Iraq, one of the things that helped to undermine that stable civil society, ironically enough, were the sanctions. The UN sanctions that were imposed after the first Gulf War, which deeply impoverished Iraq, destabilized Iraqi society. As she talks, people talking about professors wandering, well-respected professors in Iraqi universities wandering the streets begging for money because there was none. And so the degree to which the maintenance of Saddam Hussein in power and held in the sanctions regime did go a long way, I think, to creating conditions that made a U.S. mission of pacifying the country and then establishing a new stable government that much more difficult. But the what ifs with Iraq go on. We could be here all afternoon. So let's move on to the next question. Here, we've got three in the front here, and then we'll come over to this side too. Here, and then there, yeah, those three.
Hi, thank you for Hudson Institute holding this event. My name is Ping. I'm from Epoch Time newspaper. Yesterday, two major things happened in China mainland economic field. First one is a Black Monday for the stock market, and second is the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank was officially launched. And with all the GDP, China's GDP keep on dropping, and the AIIBs still was able to launch, and with 57 countries present, 50 countries signed agreement. And do you think this result is a reflection of American foreign policy? It's hard to see this country choose side. A lot of them are really Americans, strong ally country. But we still have U.S. still have Japan by side, but one compared to 50.
Right.
And how American regain the trust from the international society, especially the Asia Pacific region and the NATO and other part, and also for Taiwan policy and the mainland China policy. Taiwan constantly wanted to play bigger role, but especially during the Ebola crisis, Taiwan was pushed away, although they want to be part of it. So if I remember correctly, Congressman Smith Chris said this is not so wise politics, and he used more straightforward words. So how do you think about the Taiwan policy, mainland China policy, and also?
This is a very interesting and important question, and we have not talked about China at all. Surveying American foreign policy dysfunctions takes a long time right now. So you have to be selective about where you target. But let's talk about China as another example of Obama strategic failures you talk about in the book.
Yeah, well, I think the development bank is a very telling and I think troubling development where most of the U.S. allies in the region, in fact, ended up going along with China, despite the fact the U.S. very much encouraged them not to sign on to this bank. And I think that is a reflection of declining confidence in the United States. I think in part of it is specifically what the U.S. is doing in the Asia Pacific. China appears to be pursuing a policy of gaining control over waters through sort of small provocations that aren't going to drive the United States to the brink of war. So the Scarborough Shoal, for example, I think is a worrying trend. And it's again a case where the U.S. could have probably taken a harder line. We backed off, and so when other countries see the United States not standing firm against China, I think that causes them to change their outlook. And having covered Vietnam, I think you look back to the 1960s, you actually see some things aren't that different from what they were then. You had the U.S. and China competing for prestige, and I think sometimes the United States overestimates the value of its it's democracy, and we tend to think a lot of these countries will side with us because they may be closer to us politically than China. But I think, most countries in Asia are certainly very conscious of who is stronger, and China, their defense budget's getting bigger. They're building artificial islands. They're building more ships. They're talking about the China dream, that they're going to become this great power, whereas the United States, we have declining budgets. We're not talking about how we want to be this great Pacific power very much. We're showing in other parts of the world that we are in retreat. And so I think there's a great fear of isolationism in the United States, which I think is not just a problem with the administration. There's also within the Republican Party, there's an isolationist wing, and I think there's also, and I talk in the book a bit about how the millennial generation in the United States seems to be more inclined towards isolationism. They don't seem to understand, why there's a need or believe there's a need for a strong U.S. presence overseas. And that, again, is where I think national leadership can be important in terms of really explaining to people explaining to the American people why we need to be concerned about what's going on in the South China Sea. Because I think right now, certainly, America is in the decline in the Asia-Pacific region. It doesn't have to be, but if we keep shrinking our defense budgets, that's going to mean smaller, air and naval presence. The pivot to Asia, the intent was correct in that we need more military forces there to strengthen confidence in us, but it hasn't actually delivered those forces because of what sequestration and other budget cuts have done.
Okay, next question, the gentleman there, and then you're next, and then the lady in the second row.
I'm Dr. Willie Curtis from the U.S. Naval Academy. You mentioned two things in your response there, the millennial generation and the fact, to a large extent, that I think the American public doesn't really understand or even discuss geopolitics, especially in regards to great power politics. And so we misinterpret why the Russians go into Crimea and so forth. But what I want to pose to you is, how do we deal with the next generation of advisors to the president? Okay, because this generation, as you essentially alluded to there, they have no experience in the Cold War. They have no experience in the post-Cold War period. And a lot of what you're talking about regarding counterinsurgency and so forth was, to a large extent, a result of failures in the Bosnia situation and so forth. So American people take a dim view of that. But how do we get the advisors and the staffers that's going to be advising the next president and the National Security Council about this multipolar threat environment that we're involved in today?
Tremendous question.
Yeah. Well, I think I would say, Generation X, which is my generation, and which I think will be will certainly be important for the next couple decades, I think is in decent shape. I think, Generation X has a fairly good understanding of global problems and the dangers of getting disengaged. Certainly not universally true, but and I do think the experiences of Iraq and Afghanistan probably have jaded a lot of people across generations, which, again, I think is very unfortunate, because in both cases we could have maintained something. The fact that we pulled out, especially in Iraq, and now it's gone to hell, I think a lot of people will look at that. They won't look at what the intervening steps. They'll just look at the final outcome and say, well, we went to Iraq and it was a total disaster, and that could happen in Afghanistan. The millennials, I think, is where we really have the biggest challenge, because you not only have a lot of recent troubles, but there also just seems to be this general view that they are not, they don't really believe in very much in broader principles. And probably you could have said a lot of the same things about the baby boom generation. So maybe it's not irreversible. And there's some people would argue, well, the United States is going to get over this isolationist swing, and we've gone through this before. It's not going to be permanent. So I think that might be true. On the other hand, if you look at Europe, the great European imperial powers, Britain, France, they have, 100 years ago, you probably said, well, they would never become isolationists or lose their interest, but they, to a large extent, have lost their interest, at least on the military side. Now, they still like doing foreign aid and other things, but they no longer want to, aspire to really be great military powers. So I do think there's a danger at some point that, if we could get to a point where this change in thinking becomes permanent and that the U.S. really is going to retreat from world affairs to a large extent, at least in terms of military intervention, which I think is particularly concerning because there's not really a viable substitute, or certainly not one we would like. I mean, you would then allow Russia and China and Iran to be dominant in certain regions, and none of those countries really are especially compatible with our interests in those regions.
Zach Yule from Newsmax. So my question is on the topic of the Kurds. If you look at the U.S.'s relationship between the Kurds, especially in Turkey and Iraq, it's been kind of shaky. Where do you see us interacting with them in the future, and do you think they'll play a larger role in sort of taking back Iraq or just the broader Middle East?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. It's been a lot of discussion lately about, should we just be giving more to the Kurds because they seem to be pretty good at fighting ISIS, and certainly they have made some important, gains. But couple difficulties. One is that some of the areas where ISIS is located are not near the Kurds, and I don't think the Kurds really would want to go into all those areas. They're not probably going to settle those areas, and if they did try to, depopulate Sunni areas, that would create lots of problems of its own. We've also seen, Turkey. I mean, and this has been a problem going back many years, but Turkey now is talking about, really going in and fighting the Kurds because of their fears of Kurdish separatism, and I don't think that's something that the United States can ignore. So I do think that Kurds will play. They have an important role to play, and we should keep supporting them. But I don't see them as sort of the cure to the problems. I don't think they're going to go into Raqqa, where the ISIS capital. Partly just because the places where we've been able to help them, we've been using air power, but we're not going to go probably into Raqqa and just totally demolish a city of 500,000 people and kill lots of women and children. So there's got to be other ways, and Syria is particularly problematic because we don't have. The latest news is we've only been able to get a couple hundred Syrian rebels to sign up for our training programs, partly because we've been
signed up with everybody else.
When we're telling them, well, we want you to only fight ISIS but not the Assad government, and most of them don't want to do that. So I don't think we have come up with a solution to that problem. I think probably we need to take a firmer stand against Assad, but I don't think much is going to get resolved in Syria before the end of this president's presidency, because he doesn't seem to want to take more vigorous action really than, like a lot of things, the Syrian rebels is kind of a token gesture. It sounds like we're doing something, but we're really not doing much.
I'm going to play devil's advocate before we get to your question, really quick. And that is, some would argue, you look at the situation in Syria, Iraq, it spills over into Turkey, eastern part, Kurdish areas there, and so on. You sort of say, you know what, this is a fire, you should just let it burn itself out. Here we are with these conflicts. You've got ISIS killing Assad forces, you've got Quds force from Iran killing ISIS, you've got Kurds killing ISIS and killing Assad. Let the fire burn itself out. Let them all kill each other. Why does this in any way become a major subject for discussion in American foreign policy, except for the fact, of course, that we are supposedly responsible for that by the invasion of Iraq? And why should we worry about what's happening now? Why shouldn't we just, we're looking ahead instead for when the fire is finally out and how we go about rebuilding those societies from there?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think a lot of Americans are asking themselves that question because they haven't really gotten the administration explain to them why we need to do this. it is telling, the Obama administration, which all along said we didn't need troops in Iraq, the wrong war. The fact that they're sending more troops over there, I think, indicates that even they understand that this is not a problem that we can just turn our backs on. I think we've gotten lucky in a number of cases in terms of dodging bullets from. I mean, we have certainly seen some pretty significant terrorist attacks. I mean, the attack on Friday in Tunisia, where they killed dozens of European tourists, is, I think, a pretty disturbing sign. We had the beheading of a French oil worker. I think it's harder for ISIS to get to the United States, and if we don't care at all what happens to anyone outside of our country, you could make a bit of a stronger case that, yeah, let's not worry about that. But you do have, for one thing, you've got a lot of Americans living overseas who I think we do need to be concerned about. We're now taking a policy that we're going to pay ransoms for hostages, which I think is opening the door to more Americans being kidnapped. I think we're going to see an unfortunate rise in that. We also, I do think this violence between Sunnis and Shiites is, I think, creating more radicals. I mean, certainly some of them are killing each other off, but if you look at the number of extremist fighters out there, it seems to be going up and up. So they seem to be producing people at a faster rate than they're getting killed off. And now that ISIS controls territory, they're recruiting people. And we're claiming that we've killed very large numbers of ISIS fighters, but the latest indications are that their strength is as high as it's been. So I think
we used to make fun of that strategy, the idea of killing off terrorists faster than they could be recruited. And yet it seems to be the one that we're employing right now with regard to ISIS.
Yeah, and there's certainly I think we're going to be seeing more lone wolf attacks inspired by ISIS, and we've had a number of cases where people have come pretty close. And fortunately, we're pretty good at uncovering some of those ahead of time, but you do have people like the Tsarnaev brothers who blew up the Boston Marathon. And there are clear indications that people in the United States, especially sort of disillusioned youth, are deciding to join ISIS or other groups like that because of the successes that they see and the effective use of social media. Now, if we don't care that occasionally somebody guns down 30 Americans or sets off a bomb in a shopping mall, then maybe we can sit back. I think the American people are not going to stand for that. Now, you can argue, well, more people get killed in car wrecks. Well, okay, yeah, that may be true, but I think when our security is threatened, the American people are not going to sit back indefinitely and be willing to just take a very passive and reactive approach to all of this.
Which we might have avoided if we'd taken a more proactive approach in the first place.
Right.
You've been very patient, so why don't you go ahead?
My name is Carol Greenwald, and I'm from CAMERA, Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting in America. I actually have two questions. One, you outlined how the vice president gave lousy advice to the president, but Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State through much of this. What was her advice there? And my second question is, for the new president, assuming that we do know correctly the outlines of the nuclear deal with Iran, how would you advise the next president to undo the strategic failure?
Yeah, those are good questions. On Iraq, I still think there's a lot in it, and I caution the book. We're still in there's a lot of historical documentation that we still await, and as a historian, I know that some of that's going to come out 30 years from now. So Hillary Clinton's role in Iraq, I think, there's still a lot of open questions. I mean, it was interesting. I believe Susan Rice the other day said that one of Hillary Clinton's biggest accomplishments was getting us out of Iraq. She did. I do think she was supported keeping some kind of U.S. troop presence there. So I would say I would give her some credit for that. I mean, I think she did not want to see Maliki take control, have an unfettered access to the country. I think if you are, the country that I criticize her the most for is Libya, where she really thought Libya was going to be this great success, and some of the recent emails that have come out recently show that this was going to be her great success story that she could tout, and how we went in there and deposed the regime without U.S. troops, and we used all this diplomacy and make everything happen, which obviously hasn't worked out, and I think that also, the desire to keep U.S. troops out, I argue, led to the Benghazi tragedy. Now, in terms of Iran, I do think the current deal is a bad deal for the United States and its allies, and so I tend to agree with a lot of the advice that the Republicans have out there now. You should not accept this deal. Again, part of it too. The other thing I would say about Iran is that we have, by removing our forces from the region, we have removed our deterrent capability, which Iran certainly pays a lot of attention to how many American forces are in the region, and having made clear now that we don't have anything like the capability to go in there, I think will embolden them in the nuclear talks, and also, say at some point somebody bombs Iran's nuclear sites. Well, how are they going to respond to that? I think how the U.S.'s posture in the region will contribute to that. I'll let you are an expert on Iran, so if you have any comments on that, I'm here.
Oh, I would love to comment on that, but you know what? We're going to have to close this down. Our time is up. But let's thank our author for a far-ranging and very illuminating discussion. Thank you. Thank you.